Hello guys, it's Unders, and in this video we're going to be diving into another H-series plugin from Waves, and this is the hybrid reverb. I've got two versions of H-Verb open. The top section here we have H-Verb standard, and then below we have H-Verb long. Now the difference between the two is very, very simple. It is the extension of reverb time. So the long version can go to a considerably longer 12 seconds, whereas the default unit can only go to 6. This is the only difference between the two. And the reason for it, the longer tail reverb uses more CPU, is a more intensive plugin as a result. So it simply gives you that control of having a reduced CPU load. And in 99% of cases, I will never be using the long tail one. So something that's unique about H-Verb and what makes it a hybrid is it's a combination of two types of reverb. And I'll list more details in the description below if you'd like to dive into that. Essentially, the real sell of it is that it has an infinite impulse and reflection response rather than it being a fixed amount of pre-configured reflections or very short delays. This allows it to make very realistic and lush sounding spaces or be very sparse and undetailed in its reflections, giving us an extra flexibility and allowing it to fill the space of multiple reverb types. Then obviously being a completely digital reverb, it has some luxuries like sync controls and other things within inside it as well. So when we first open it, this is the preset we're given. And what I've set up here are some of the sounds that I've wanted to give their own space in this mixer going to the reverb. I've also sent the hook vocals into it as well. So the reverb that we've currently got going on is like this.
Have you seen her? Have you seen her on the scene? She's not that for you. Man eater, she will leave.
So it's giving a huge cavernous space at the moment, but we can tweak that and set it up to be exactly as we want. So let's break down all of the features inside H-Verb. One of the things we're going to do very first off the bat is expand the plugin so we can see all of its inner workings. So down here in the right hand corner it says expand. We have a little drop down arrow. And our plugin's going to get considerably bigger and look a lot more confusing. So let's now begin at the top. And at the top, we've got a nice GUI representation of our reverb time, our early reflections, able to be changed and manipulated from this view up here, which is quite nice. We can see the contact point here right in the middle, for example, and that's attached to our reverb time. It doesn't just go quite simply linear. We can do the level of it as well, so it's changed over time. You'll also notice we've got these other points up here, and these can also be moved, and we've got now a full ADSR style control of our reverb time. And as you can see, as we adjust those, it's moving the pre-delay, the build-up, and then there's also been adjusting the tail. We've also got these handles right in the bottom corners, and they're going to change our overall reverb time, as well as our pre-delay here. These two handles work separately to give effectively our pre-delay and attack. I personally prefer to work with the controls, and all of the controls for what we just used are just below here in this next section. Something nice to have in here is to very quickly be able to set this up as we like, and we can switch sync on our pre-delay, for example, and sync that to the BPM of a track. We can have that occur at 164, for example, which should be nicely in time with drums. Even if they're at 116, it's going to give a nice rhythm to the reverb. We can now hit test to get an idea of how that space would sound. Now, an incredibly powerful feature that allows for a great effect with very little processing is just to tap reverse over here, and we can now get that reverse reverb effect very quickly. And this can be great for really sort of trippy effects on things. And you can use that for your own demonic variations as much as you like. So switching sync on pre-delay allows us to sync to the BPM of our DAW, which, like I said, is very useful, especially if we're doing something drum related or percussion related and we're sending lots of percussion into this. We can have it so the reverb is functioning in time with the percussion, adding to the rhythmic value of it, which is really, really useful. In terms of the size, this is one control that is quite difficult to manipulate inside the GUI, but we can see this white section over here. These are all of our and what gives us the feeling of the size of a sound or space. If we have it with a much larger size and have a listen, kind of gives the feeling of like a big warehouse space, right? If we bring size right down, it gives a slightly different impression, even though we've still got this really long reverb time. Have the reverb time up and the build-up time after the early reflections, it gives even more of a feeling of a cavernous space. Bit of an exaggerated example, but something like this. So now we're getting the impression that it's taking time for the sound to travel. If we want to get quite a small, tight vocal sound, we need to bring the size quite down, and we need to really bring our reverb time nice and tight as well.
Have you seen her? Have you seen her on the scene? You have never put man eater. She will leave you so deceived. You have never put. Have you seen her? Have you seen her on the scene? You have never put man eater. She will leave you so deceived. You have never put. Have you seen her? Have you seen her on the scene? You have never put.
Now we've really just been manipulating the build up to a degree, the size, and then the time overall. Well, the next control that we've got here is a balance between our early reflections and our tail. So we can really gear it towards just being heavy early reflections.
Have you seen her? Have you seen her on the scene?
So it gives a very, very short and tight reverb, or we can balance it and weight it much more heavily towards the tail and take those early reflections away, just giving the sense of space, but from a very isolated point.
Have you seen her? Have you seen her on the scene? Man eater, she will leave you so deceived. You have never fun. Have you seen her? Have you seen her on the scene?
So hopefully you can hear there that it's very two different types of reverb, and we can blend between the two. And that's where this becomes the hybrid reverb. Our next controls are fairly self-explanatory. We have our dry wet mix. Now this is on a bus, so it's 100% wet. If you're applying it directly to your effect, you would balance it between dry and wet. And output is our end output signal. I will personally balance this with my bus adjustment for how much is going into the reverb. But if you're doing some kind of crazy effect that's maybe distorting the reverb, you would bring that output backwards. Now, just below our time section here, we have the ER select. Now, this is our early reflections style select effectively. And by default, it's on 5, and there are a number of different types. And as you can see, 1, for example, is a really natural early reflections fade off.
Have you seen her? Have you seen her on the scene? She have never fun. Man eater, she will leave you so deceived. She have never fun. Have you seen her?
For to bring that to 10, for example, which actually increases the early reflections over time.
Have you seen her? Have you seen her on the scene? She have never.
It kind of gives that feeling of it actually increasing in level. It's an effect that you might find works in your track. Again, these are things to play around with when adjusting your sound and what you like. Now, everything after this is more in the detailed controlled section. So when we hit expand, all of these appear. So we've got detailed control over our decay envelope, our input echoes, and these can be switched on and off as well, and we have different types. And the input echoes are the delay taps. They're the initial responses that give the feeling of a reverb in space. They're the reflections that happen very, very quickly. We've then got our output echoes, and these are the echoes and delay reflections of the input echoes. Again, these can be switched off as well. And notice in the GUI we can see a representation of how these are behaving. If I switch them off, they disappear in the GUI and we can hear the difference.
Have you seen her? Have you seen her on the scene? She have never fun.
So there we've got a very plain digital feeling reverb. If we switch these guys on,
Have Have you seen her? Have you seen her on the scene? The truth of them.
That's much warmer and much more natural feeling. So that's kind of where the magic's happening. Switching those guys off gives that very digital, let's say pre-2000 digital EQ kind of feeling. And then we've got something a little bit more advanced in here. We have a dynamics section and we can switch that on and we can have it so the reverb ducks as well, or compresses, or de-esses. The de-esser can be overly useful if you're doing what I'm doing here and sending vocals into this reverb unit. So if we were to give it a range of say, minus 18-ish, it should nicely de-ess those on the reverb end.
Have you seen her? Have you seen her on the scene? The truth of them. My leader, she will lead you, so to speak. The truth of them. Have you seen her? Have you seen her on the scene? The truth of them.
And that's helping out a little bit. Let me just A/B that for you.
Have you seen her? Have you seen her on the scene? The truth of them.
There's lots of S's in that section. They're really sticking through.
Have you seen her? Have you seen her on the scene? The truth of them. Have you seen her? Have you seen her on the scene? Have you seen her? Have you seen her on the scene?
That just saves you having to de-ess or add some EQ after the fact. So it's very useful to have that built directly into the reverb unit. Now the middle section might look quite obvious, just like it's an EQ, right, for the reverb. However, it's not really what it is. It's got a couple of things going on in it. There are simple frequency EQ, but we've also got this G section here, and it's actually applying to the early reflections filter.
Have you seen her? Have you seen her on the scene? The truth of them. My leader, she will lead you, so to speak. The truth of them. Have you seen her? Have you seen her on the scene? The truth of them. Have you?
If you bring the high shelf down to the bottom, it does in fact become a roll-off. And the same applies for the high pass. The same applies for the high shelf as well. If you bring that right down, it actually goes into a low pass. Now, low passing a reverb can give it a much more natural feel. Notice if all of the high ends in there.
Have you seen her? Have you seen her on the scene? The truth of them.
Doesn't quite seem right as a reverb, and that's because we're used to lots of the high end being lost in reflections, so actually rolling it off feels a lot more natural.
Have you seen her? Have you seen her on the scene? The truth of them. My leader, she.
And we can just click and engage pretty much any of these and have whatever kind of balance we like. If we found that it was being particularly muddy, for example, like here,
Have you seen her? Have you seen her?
we can just bring that out in the reflections.
My leader, she will lead you, so.
And they've also got a Q control. We can be really quite narrow with these.
Have you seen her? Have you seen her on the scene? The truth of them.
So that gives us quite a nice feel there with how it's working. Then moving over to the right hand side, gets a little bit more complex here. Now we're looking at the dampening effect. And this really is kind of the frequency response coming out. And we call it dampening because we're usually going to take away from that rather than add to it. But we can absolutely give ridiculous effects to it and boosting. Notice how we're going to always have a notch if we keep these 2 points apart that will go back to 0. But we can always take away as well. And it's usually just going to be a high shelf and low shelf, but it means we can make something like this, like a nice notch just in the area we most want the reverb to come out in. So dampening you'll find in most digital EQs. And what it is a combination of frequency response against reverb time. So for example, if we were to overly reduce the frequency response here with this high shelf from sort of above 1K, bringing it down is going to be adjusted based on its ratio. So if we've got this sort of 1.5 second reverb time here, adjusting dependent on frequency and then based on its ratio, we'll adjust it over time. So if we've say got a 4-second decay time and adjust it by a ratio of 1.5, we'll end up with a 6-second decay.
Have you seen her? Have you seen her on the scene?
So here you can hear the high frequency really extending on for a lot longer, whereas in reality, dampening would cause the higher frequencies to fade out a lot sooner than the lower frequencies, something like this.
Have you seen her? Have you seen her on the scene?
And maybe in extreme cases, we would get something like this. So now the body of the voice carries on for a lot longer than the high end. Now notice we can only have one of these modules engaged. If I switch back to dampening, we now have our dampening effect instead. And lastly is an LFO control over the same parameters. I've never actually used the envelope or LFO. I've always found the dampening to be the most useful. However, if you're getting into some effects and design, you can have some serious fun with the envelopes and LFO to create very unusual sounds. Next, below these, we have the modulation that affects. So we've got AM depth, AM rate, and FM mix. If we switch this unit on, the FM mix is probably going to be the most notable, which will introduce some flanging on the reverb. If we push up the AM rate, personally, I quite like the clean reverb sound that comes from this, and I seldom use these, but again, for sound design purposes, super useful. And lastly, we've got global, and probably the tastiest thing in global is this drive knob right here, because we can drive the reverb and add loads of extra yummy harmonics, and it's a really nice type of saturation. Push that and it's still a nice pleasant sound. It's a beautiful little thing. We then also have the analog and digital controls. What digital does is reduce the bit rate. And dropping it to 8-bit gives a much more crunchy feel. Have you seen her on the scene? Whereas analog switches on analog modeling, very similar to the Waves NLS style of plugin, which I've done a whole separate video on. In short, if you just want to quickly set a reverb up, we don't need any of this, and we can switch these units on as we like. Output echoes and input echoes give that lush feeling, and we can quickly switch between our early response reflection types for different feelings, and we can set pretty much everything we need here. If we want to get really in depth and start tweaking the sound to work in the mix and performance, things like maybe taking out the low end directly from the earlier reflections on something like a vocal, we can do that directly in the plugin. If we want to get a little bit tasty in terms of drive and giving it a real analog feel, we can switch on analog and give it some drive here. And let's just A and B it, for example, with the vocal on. Have you seen her? Have you seen her on the scene? She's not never funny. Man eater, she will leave ya so deceived. She's not never funny. Have you seen her? Have you seen her on the scene? She's not never funny. Have you seen her? Have you seen her on the scene? She's not never funny. Man eater, she will leave ya so deceived. She's not never funny. Like I said before, I would then be balancing it out here on my bus, just adjusting it to where I like it. Have you seen her? Have you seen her on the scene? She's not never funny. Man eater, she will leave ya so deceived. She's not never funny. Have you seen her? Have you seen her on the scene? So that, guys, that was my breakdown of H-Verb and how I'm using it and the features I like using it for. I hope the video was helpful for you guys, and I will see you on the next one.